The first time I realized just how little I mattered in my own home, it didn't come with a fight or a harsh word. It came with laughter. Sharp, loud, and completely foreign, echoing from my own kitchen. I peered through the doorway and froze. My name is Eleanor. I'm 66 years old, and I live in an old house in the suburbs of Chicago. I never thought I'd have to share this story with the world, but now there's no other choice. Before I begin, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to support more emotional family stories like mine, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your reflections and experiences, because sometimes sharing is the first step toward healing. 25 people were wandering through my house, opening cabinets, fiddling with the silverware, and acting like every corner of my life was theirs to inspect. And there she was, Sophia, my son Jason's wife, standing at the center like a conductor of chaos, smiling with that smug satisfaction I'd come to dread. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of disbelief and fury I hadn't felt in years. For 5 years, I had been invisible here, treated less like a mother-in-law and more like a housekeeper who happened to live under the same roof. Jason, my son, used to be the boy I tucked in at night, the one I stayed up with when he was sick, the one I trusted to stand by me. Now, he watched Sophia orchestrate this circus and simply nodded, pretending none of it bothered him. I had cooked, cleaned, and sacrificed, hoping that one day they would see me as family. But hope was a fragile thing, and it had shattered long ago. And then came this Sophia's grand Christmas plan. She had invited distant relatives, people I barely knew, along with business associates she thought could help her financially, all without consulting me. I could see her logic. She wanted to impress them, to prove she was capable and influential. But the audacity of using my home as a stage for her deception was too much to bear. My hands shook as the weight of it all settled on me. Years of quiet humiliation, now culminating in a public display of control that wasn't hers to claim. I knew I had to act, but not out of impulse. The moment required precision. I started with the house itself. I emptied the fridge of everything she might misuse, locked away the fine china, and canceled the cleaning service she relied on. Every detail was intentional. Her comfort and her usual tricks were stripped away. I watched my home transform into a battlefield where she would finally face the consequences of her own actions. Next, I prepared my secret weapon, evidence. For months, I had quietly collected proof of Sophia's fraudulent behavior, $50,000 in debts racked up under my name, falsified documents, and hidden accounts. I sent carefully curated copies to her closest relatives, the very people she hoped to impress and manipulate. I imagined their reactions, the shock, the anger, the inevitable questions that would expose her carefully constructed facade. Before leaving for a short vacation, I walked through the rooms one last time, touching the furniture, the photographs, the walls that had absorbed my family's laughter and tears for decades. Driving away, the quiet of the mountains wrapped around me, but inside, I was anything but calm. The storm I had endured for half a decade was about to erupt, and this time, I would be the one holding the reins. On Christmas morning, the house erupted in tension. 25 people, unaware of the storm about to hit, were caught in a whirlwind of revelations. Calls were made, whispers passed, and faces fell as the truth emerged. Sophia's debts, her lies, her deception all laid bare. When I returned with my lawyer, the confrontation reached its peak. Amendments to the will, strict residency rules, and legal consequences were announced. Sophia, forced to face the consequences, crumbled under the weight of exposure. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of calm strength. I had reclaimed my life, my home, and my dignity. Years of silence, of invisible suffering, had culminated in a moment of clarity and justice. Standing there, watching Sophia face the repercussions of her actions, I realized something profound. A mother's love and resilience can endure betrayal, humiliation, and manipulation, and still rise stronger than ever. I remember the weeks leading up to that Christmas like a slow, tightening coil. Every day, Sophia's manipulations grew bolder. She'd come into the kitchen with a list of demands, expecting me to drop everything, cooking, cleaning, even ironing clothes she had piled up in heaps. Jason, caught in some strange mix of loyalty and denial, never intervened. He would mutter half-hearted apologies or shrug, leaving me to bear the full weight of her cruelty. At first, I tried to reason with them both. I tried gentle words, trying to explain boundaries, to remind them that respect was not optional. But Sophia's response was always a saccharine smile, a dismissive wave of her hand, as if I were a child whining about nonsense. And Jason? He quietly reinforced her authority, leaving me silenced, cornered in my own home. The emotional toll was immense. I would wake up each morning feeling a pit in my stomach, knowing that by the time I brewed my first cup of coffee, I would already be exhausted from anticipating the tasks Sophia expected me to complete. Yet, I kept going. I kept quiet. Part of me thought if I endured, if I played along, perhaps one day Jason would remember who I was, his mother, and Sophia would show some decency. But the truth, buried under layers of hope and denial, was plain. They did not care. My years of silent service had not earned me a single ounce of respect. It was the morning she first mentioned the 25 guests that everything snapped into focus. She waltzed into the kitchen, breathless with excitement, practically vibrating with the thrill of her own cunning. "Mom," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness, "I've invited everyone for Christmas. Don't worry. I'll handle everything. It'll be wonderful." I stared at her, heart pounding, not sure whether to laugh or cry. I tried to remind her that my house wasn't a venue for her schemes, that she had never consulted me, that she had debts and secrets she was hiding, but she waved me off like I was a mosquito buzzing near her ear. And Jason, standing silently beside her, did nothing. My mind screamed at him, "Don't you see what she's doing?" But he remained still, a statue of indecision and misplaced loyalty. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the house quiet except for the ticking of the clock, and I realized something terrifying and freeing. I had allowed this for years. I had allowed my presence to be dismissed, my labor exploited, and my dignity stripped away. And yet, I also realized that the power to end it had always been mine. I didn't have to endure any longer. I could reclaim my life, my home, and my sense of self-respect. The plan started forming in my mind like a blueprint, deliberate, precise, and unyielding. First, I would leave. A simple vacation, a plausible excuse, but one that would leave Sophia in charge of the chaos she had invited into my house. I packed quietly, imagining her panic as she realized she had no support staff, no stocked fridge, no clean silver, no safety net of my constant presence. I emptied the refrigerator, locking away the delicacies she would have carelessly wasted. I secured the fine china, the crystal glasses, the heirlooms she had always treated like disposable decorations. I even canceled the cleaning service she relied on without a second thought. Each small act was a step toward turning her own hubris into a trap she couldn't escape. Next, the evidence. For months, I had quietly documented everything: credit card statements, showing her mounting debts, official documents proving she had used my name without permission, and emails exposing the truth behind her constant lies. I sent carefully selected pieces to her closest relatives, the ones she relied on for influence and support. Watching the storm I had quietly prepared begin to ripple across the family network gave me a sense of power I had not felt in years. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, reclaiming what had been stolen from me. and forcing accountability in a way that left no room for denials. Then came the drive to the cabin I had rented, a small retreat tucked into the snow-dusted mountains. I remember the silence hitting me the moment I pulled away from the driveway, a stark contrast to the chaos I had left behind. I felt strangely light, as if the years of burden had been left behind in my home, trapped within walls that Sophia had abused. But the calm was deceptive. In my mind, I could picture the unraveling, beginning the tension, the questioning glances, the whispers growing into confrontations. I was far away, yet intimately connected, anticipating every reaction, every faltering smile, every lie crumbling under scrutiny. By the time Christmas morning arrived, the house had become a theater of truth. 25 people, once pawns in Sophia's plan, were now witnesses to the reality of her deception. Calls were made, arguments sparked, and the smiles she had carefully curated fell into shock and disbelief. I remained miles away, observing the storm unfold from a distance, heart pounding in equal parts dread and anticipation. Every moment of silence, every gasp of realization was a small victory. When I returned with my lawyer by my side, the confrontation reached its peak. Sophia's carefully constructed world collapsed as we announced amendments to the will. She would be barred from selling the house, restricted in residency, and held accountable for the identity fraud she had committed. Jason finally looked at me, not with indifference, but with the weight of the truth pressing on him. And I felt a long, deep exhale, my home reclaimed, my dignity restored, my voice finally heard after years of silence. The days after that Christmas felt surreal, as if I had stepped into a world where time moved differently, and yet every detail of the confrontation replayed endlessly in my mind. Sophia avoided me entirely, retreating into a corner of the house she once dominated with smug confidence. Jason hovered between guilt and confusion, unsure how to navigate the tension he had helped create. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years: lightness. Not the naive kind of relief that comes from small victories, but the profound weightlessness of finally standing up for myself, of reclaiming my space, my dignity, and my voice. But reclaiming my life didn't erase the emotional scars. Every corner of the house held memories of subtle betrayals. Sarah's laughter at my expense, Jason dismissing my concerns with a casual shrug, Sophia's eyes flashing with contempt when I dared speak. I wandered from room to room, touching the furniture, the walls, the photographs, and felt both nostalgia and sorrow, mourning not only what had been lost, but also the years of quiet endurance that had brought me here. I realized that while justice had been served, it came with a bittersweet aftertaste. The family I had known, the innocence of my home, had been irreparably altered. Yet, there was also clarity. For the first time in years, I understood the power of preparation, observation, and patience. I had acted not out of spite, but with precision, gathering evidence, creating leverage, and using the knowledge I had amassed to ensure that the years of disrespect could not continue. The experience taught me that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, deliberate, and ultimately unstoppable. And in this quiet power, I found a sense of peace I hadn't known in decades. I began to notice subtle shifts around the house. Jason started asking questions not to defend Sophia, but to understand the gravity of the situation. His tone was softer, hesitant, as if he were learning to see me as a person again, rather than an accessory to his life. Sophia, though she continued to live under the same roof, was cautious, calculating each word, each action, aware that I was no longer the invisible presence she could manipulate at will. My authority had been reestablished not with violence, but with strategy, evidence, and the unwavering assertion of my rights. Despite the chaos, moments of tenderness emerged. I spent quiet afternoons in the living room, sipping tea and reflecting on the journey. The house, once a battleground of resentment and quiet suffering, slowly began to feel like home again, not because Sophia or Jason had changed completely, but because I had reclaimed the space within it that belonged to me. Every locked cabinet, every secured document, every letter of proof was a boundary that reminded me I had survived betrayal and emerged stronger. The legal process was slow but ultimately satisfying. Sophia faced not only the requirement to repay her debts, but also the looming reality of identity fraud charges. Every document filed, every meeting with the lawyer, every acknowledgement from family members who had witnessed the truth reinforced that my actions were justified, necessary, and moral. I had chosen not to be passive any longer, and the consequences rippled outward in ways that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Emotionally, the victory was transformative. I realized that years of passive endurance had eroded my self-worth, leaving me feeling powerless. But this experience, painful as it had been, taught me resilience, patience, and the power of strategic action. I discovered that the love I had poured into my family did not obligate me to tolerate abuse. I could honor that love by defending myself, by standing firm, by ensuring that my efforts and sacrifices were respected. And slowly, the house began to breathe with a sense of restored order. I cooked again, not because I was expected to, but because I wanted to, because reclaiming my role had shifted it from obligation to choice. Jason began to consult me on household matters, small gestures at first, tentative but sincere. Sophia, meanwhile, adjusted her behavior, wary of provoking me. The emotional landscape of the home was altered, and for the first time in years, I felt the fragile, glowing warmth of stability. In the quiet evenings, I sometimes caught myself smiling, a real, unburdened smile that had been absent for far too long. The road to this point had been paved with betrayal, manipulation, and deceit, but it had also led to self-discovery, empowerment, and an unshakable assertion of my dignity. I realized that the home I had built, the family I had nurtured, and the life I had lived deserved protection, not silence, not submission, but action. The ordeal was over, but the lessons lingered. I had learned the subtle power of patience, the necessity of documentation, and the quiet strength of measured retaliation. More importantly, I had learned that love for one's family does not demand self-erasure. Protecting oneself, asserting boundaries, and reclaiming dignity is not betrayal. It is survival. And as I sat in my living room, surrounded by the echoes of Christmas chaos and the faint scent of victory, I understood that the mother I had always been could also be the force that safeguards her life, her home, and her worth. The weeks that followed were an emotional roller coaster I hadn't anticipated. Sophia's avoidance turned into thinly veiled hostility. Every glance she gave me felt like a test, a silent challenge to see if I had lost my nerve. But I didn't. I had spent years as the invisible presence in my own home. Now, every word I spoke, every step I took, was deliberate, controlled, measured. Jason seemed caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to his wife and the undeniable truth he could no longer ignore. Watching him struggle was painful, but it also reminded me that my son wasn't beyond reach. He just needed to see reality stripped of the illusion Sophia had so carefully crafted. I began to notice how her manipulations had seeped into every corner of my life. There were bills left unpaid, correspondence ignored, and countless small deceptions that, when added together, painted a damning picture. I meticulously cataloged every instance, not out of obsession, but to ensure that every action had a consequence. Sophia's arrogance had always been fueled by the belief that no one was watching, that she could bend reality without repercussions. For the first time, She realized that I had been quietly observing, patiently gathering proof, and preparing for the moment when truth would no longer be optional. Preparing the legal documentation was grueling, emotionally exhausting. I met with my lawyer repeatedly, reviewing evidence, drafting letters, and ensuring that everything was airtight. Each time I read through the statements of debt and identity fraud, I felt a surge of righteous anger. How dare she violate my trust? How dare she exploit the mother of the man she had married? But beneath the anger, there was also a steady undercurrent of satisfaction. This was a battle I could win, and I would not let the years of manipulation dictate the outcome. One evening, as snow fell silently outside, I sat alone in the living room, reflecting on how far this had gone. The quiet was both comforting and haunting. I thought of the countless Christmases past, the decorations carefully placed, the meals lovingly prepared, and the laughter that should have filled these walls. Sophia had tried to poison all of that with her deceit and entitlement, but I realized that memory and effort were mine to keep. They could not touch the joy I had experienced or the love I had poured into this home. That love had been my shield, and now it became my sword. When the family gathering finally arrived, I watched from a quiet corner as Sophia's carefully constructed web began to unravel. Relatives whispered in shocked tones. Phones buzzed with evidence I had sent days before, and faces that had once smiled at her charms twisted in disbelief. The chaos she had orchestrated to impress her wealthy uncle turned into a nightmare of exposure. Each revelation, each gasping reaction was a small victory, a validation of every hour I had endured in silence, every sacrifice I had made, and every subtle humiliation I had swallowed. Returning home with my lawyer by my side was a moment of quiet triumph. Sophia's expression shifted from shock to panic as we announced the amendments to my will. She could no longer sell the house. Residency privileges were restricted, and legal action awaited her for identity fraud. Jason's eyes finally met mine with understanding, the weight of years of ignorance pressing down on him. And in that moment, I felt a sense of empowerment that went beyond simple victory. It was a reclaiming of my own life, my authority, and my dignity. The aftermath wasn't easy. Sophia's resentment simmered, Jason's guilt was palpable, and our home carried the echoes of betrayal. But amidst it all, I discovered something profound. Boundaries and accountability are not just tools, they are lifelines. I could choose how to let people treat me, and I could demand respect without guilt. The house, once a place of silent suffering, began to feel like mine again. Every locked cabinet, every secured document, every careful observation of behavior was a reminder that I had endured, acted, and prevailed. In those quiet evenings, as I sipped tea and watched the snow fall outside, I reflected on the emotional journey. Years of submission and quiet pain had led to this moment of assertive action. I realized that enduring betrayal silently does not protect anyone, it only perpetuates harm. Standing up, reclaiming control, and ensuring accountability had restored not just my home, but my sense of self. I had proven that love and resilience could coexist with firm boundaries and justice. I also noticed small but meaningful changes in Jason. He began consulting me on household decisions, asking questions, and seeking my advice not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Sophia, wary and cautious, measured her words and actions, no longer assuming she could dominate at will. And I, for the first time in years, felt an authentic peace, a recognition that I had survived, endured, and emerged stronger, wiser, and unshakably dignified. Every day, as I walked through my home, I felt the subtle reclaiming of space, time, and authority. The lessons of betrayal, patience, and careful strategy were etched deeply into my mind. I understood now that survival is not passive, that respect must be demanded and defended, and that the strength to protect oneself often comes quietly, deliberately, and without apology. I had learned that love does not require self-erasure. It requires courage, integrity, and the ability to stand firm in the face of deceit. And in those reflective moments, I knew with certainty the mother I had always been the one who nurtured, sacrificed, and loved was also the woman who could protect herself, her home, and her worth. For years, I had been treated as nothing. Now, I was everything I had ever needed to be. The following weeks settled into a strange rhythm, one that felt foreign yet exhilarating. Sophia no longer moved through the house with that careless entitlement. Every step she took was cautious, measured, like a tightrope walker aware the ground beneath her could give way at any moment. Jason still wrestled with conflicting emotions, loyalty, guilt, and finally, recognition of the truth. But the tension that had dominated the household began to ease, replaced by tentative, cautious interactions. I could feel the shift in power, subtle but undeniable, and it strengthened me in ways I hadn't realized I needed. I began to reclaim routines that had been mine for decades, but this time on my terms. I cooked not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. I arranged the living room, dusted the shelves, and walked through the house, savoring the familiar sense of home cinnamon from the kitchen, pine from the holiday decorations I had carefully preserved, and the quiet warmth of my own space. Each action, each simple choice, reinforced the truth I had been denied for so long. I belonged here, and this home would no longer serve as a stage for manipulation. The legal ramifications for Sophia were slow to unfold, but inevitable. Creditors called, statements were settled, and eventually, the threat of identity fraud charges hung over her like a dark cloud. Every meeting with the lawyer, every signed document, was a reminder of the meticulous care I had taken to ensure justice was served. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability. Sophia had crossed boundaries that were non-negotiable, and the law was finally backing me up. Seeing her falter, realizing she could no longer manipulate anyone, including her husband, her relatives, or me, brought a sense of vindication I could feel in my bones. Emotionally, however, the process was taxing. Old wounds reopened as I recalled the subtle betrayals, the dismissive gestures, the years of being treated like a shadow. But these memories, instead of weighing me down, became the fuel for my resilience. Each recollection reminded me of the patience, courage, and strategic thinking it took to finally reclaim my life. I realized that suffering alone does not define us. It is how we respond to it that shapes the trajectory of our lives. I had chosen to act, and that choice had restored not just my dignity, but my sense of self-worth. Jason's transformation was gradual. At first, he hovered in awkward silence, unsure how to act around me. But as the days passed, he began seeking my input on decisions. Small at first, planning meals, scheduling family gatherings, and even simple household repairs. His tone shifted from tentative to respectful, and while he had not yet fully reconciled with the past, the change was palpable. It was a quiet victory, a sign that even those who once turned a blind eye could learn the weight of their choices and begin to mend relationships. Sophia, meanwhile, became a study in restraint. Her smiles were tight, her words cautious. Every interaction with me was tinged with awareness. She understood that the dominance she once wielded so freely had evaporated. In observing her, I saw the consequences of unchecked ambition and deception. It wasn't about reveling in her discomfort. It was about recognizing that the power dynamic had shifted. For the first time in years, I was no longer powerless, no longer silenced, and no longer invisible in my own home. I also began to notice something profound in myself. The fear, frustration, and sadness that had accompanied me for years slowly gave way to a quiet confidence. I had endured emotional manipulation, betrayal, and humiliation. Yet I emerged not broken, but resolute. I understood that true strength is not measured by aggression or retaliation, but by patience, observation, and deliberate action. My victory was not just in reclaiming my home, but in proving to myself that I could navigate even the most insidious forms of deception with clarity and composure. There were quiet moments, too, when I allowed myself to reflect on what had been lost. Years of connection with my son had been strained by Sophia's interference. Trust had been eroded, and the innocence of familial bonds fractured. These losses were real, and I mourned them silently, knowing that while justice could be served and dignity restored, some wounds could never fully heal. Yet, even in grief, there was empowerment, a recognition that I had chosen how to respond, and in doing so, had protected my remaining relationships from further erosion. The house itself began to breathe differently. Rooms felt alive again, not suffocating under the weight of manipulation. Laughter returned, tentative at first, as Jason and I rebuilt a sense of normalcy. Even Sophia contributed in small, constrained ways. Though every move was careful, it signaled a begrudging respect for the boundaries I had set. I realized that my actions had done more than enforce rules. They had rewritten the emotional landscape of the family, and in doing so, created a space where dignity, honesty, and respect could exist. In the quiet evenings, I often found myself sitting by the window, watching the snow settle softly across the yard, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. Betrayal, humiliation, and manipulation had marked the path. Yet through strategy, patience, and unwavering resolve, I had reclaimed what was mine. I felt a sense of closure, a calm that had been absent for far too long, and an unshakable belief in my own strength. I had endured, acted, and emerged triumphant not through anger, but through clarity and courage. And in that stillness, I finally understood love does not demand sacrifice of self-worth, and endurance does not require erasure. By standing firm, asserting my boundaries, and reclaiming my life, I had proven that resilience, wisdom, and dignity are forces stronger than deception, manipulation, or fear. I was no longer the invisible presence in my own home. I was the woman who had survived, reclaimed, and thrived. The months that followed were a study in subtle transformation. The house, once thick with tension and silent resentment, gradually settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, but with an undercurrent of respect that had never existed before. Jason and I began to communicate again, hesitantly at first, then with increasing honesty. He asked questions about past decisions, about the things he had ignored, about the ways he had failed to see the truth. Listening to him, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. For the years lost, relief that finally, some understanding had taken root. Sophia's behavior changed as well, though not with warmth or apology. Her caution was palpable. Every word was measured, every movement calculated. The entitlement that had once dominated the house was replaced with wariness. I observed her not with vindictive pleasure, but with a quiet awareness. She had learned, finally, that manipulation carries consequences, and that the walls she once saw as hers to bend were no longer pliable. The balance of power had shifted, and it was a strange, almost empowering sight to witness. I also began to notice the subtle ways my own perspective had evolved. The fear, anxiety, and frustration that had defined my daily life for so long had given way to a sense of agency. I realized that the strength I had discovered in myself was not born from confrontation alone, but from the patience and strategic thinking it had taken to reclaim control. I could have reacted impulsively, with anger or shouting, but I had chosen a path that ensured my dignity remained intact, and in that choice, I had learned the true value of self-respect. The house itself became a symbol of this transformation. Rooms that had once felt oppressive now seemed open, filled with possibility. I dusted and organized not because I had to, but because it was a space I had earned back. Every locked cabinet, every secured document, every precaution I had put in place reminded me of the boundaries I had asserted and maintained. The home was no longer a place where my voice was silenced. It was a reflection of the woman I had become, resilient, observant, and unshakable. Financially, Sophia's reckoning was slow but effective. Creditors called, debts were addressed, and the looming threat of legal consequences for identity fraud forced her to confront realities she had long ignored. Each interaction she had with the lawyers, each document she signed, was a small step in her understanding that her actions could no longer go unchecked. I watched her falter, not with malice, but with a quiet acknowledgement that accountability had finally arrived. Emotionally, I began to find space for reflection and healing. I spent evenings by the window, sipping tea, watching the snow blanket the yard, and thinking of the years I had endured silently. I mourned the lost time, the moments of connection with Jason that had been tainted by her influence, the small joys that had been overshadowed by manipulation. Yet, I also celebrated the clarity and strength that had emerged from this ordeal. I had learned that endurance is not passive submission, but the careful cultivation of patience and strategy until the moment arrives to act decisively. Even Jason, tentative as he was, began to rebuild his connection with me. His questions were careful, his apologies genuine, and his gestures of support incremental but sincere. I could see that witnessing the consequences of Sophia's actions had opened his eyes. He began to understand the ways he had turned a blind eye and the responsibilities he had neglected. And while the past could not be undone, these small acts of reconciliation signaled the possibility of a healthier relationship moving forward. Sophia, for her part, remained in the household, a constant reminder of what had transpired. But her presence was no longer threatening. She had become cautious, calculating, aware that her actions were now constrained by law and by the boundaries I had firmly established. Watching her navigate this new reality reinforced my understanding that power is not given. It is claimed, defended, and maintained. I had claimed mine, and she was forced to respect it, whether she liked it or not. The transformation extended beyond the home. I felt a renewed sense of confidence in myself, my decisions, and my ability to handle adversity. The years of silent suffering, the humiliation, and the betrayals had forged a strength I had underestimated. I had learned that respect is earned through consistent action and clear boundaries, that patience can be as powerful as confrontation, and that dignity can be reclaimed even after it has been trampled repeatedly. As I moved through the house, tidying, organizing, and reclaiming the physical space as well as the emotional one, I felt a profound sense of closure. The ordeal had been long and painful, but it had also been transformative. I realized that the family I had built, the home I had nurtured, and the love I had given were worth protecting, not by silence, not by submission, but by assertive, deliberate action. I had survived betrayal, endured disrespect, and acted decisively, and in doing so, I had reclaimed not only my home, but my life. And in that quiet, reflective space, I understood a truth I had long ignored. True strength is not loud or flashy. It is patient, strategic, and unwavering. By standing firm, asserting my boundaries, and reclaiming control, I had proven that resilience and dignity are forces that cannot be stolen, manipulated, or diminished. I was no longer invisible, no longer silenced, and no longer powerless. I had endured, acted, and emerged triumphant, and in that triumph, I discovered the unshakable power of self-respect. The months that followed were quiet, but in that quiet, I felt a profound shift taking root not only in the household, but within myself. Sophia remained in the house, but she moved differently now. Her steps were cautious, her words measured. The arrogance that had once filled the walls was replaced by a careful calculation, a wariness that told me she knew I had reclaimed my authority. It was strange to watch her navigate the space she had once dominated, aware that every move could be scrutinized, every misstep potentially costly. And I watched, not with glee, but with quiet satisfaction. The balance of power had finally changed. Jason, too, began to show subtle signs of change. He came to me with questions, asking for my input on decisions that had previously been mine alone. He hesitated at first, uncertain how to approach me after years of ignoring my voice. But slowly, he began to seek guidance not because he had to, but because he genuinely wanted to understand the world he had been blind to for so long. Watching him tentatively rebuild a connection with me reminded me that even the most strained relationships could shift given honesty, accountability, and time. I also began to notice the quiet ways I had grown stronger. The fear and resentment that had colored my days for years began to fade, replaced by a steady confidence. I realized that enduring manipulation does not build character. Responding to it with deliberate action does. Every decision I made, every precaution I had taken, every document of proof I had prepared, had not just protected me, they had asserted my presence, my worth, and my voice. I felt a calm I hadn't known in years, a sense that I was no longer merely surviving, but truly living. The house itself seemed to respond to the shift in energy. Rooms that had once felt oppressive now seemed open and alive. I could walk through the halls without a tightness in my chest, touch the furniture without a sense of intrusion, and sit in my favorite chair without guilt or resentment. The home had become a reflection of the woman I had become, strong, observant, and in control. And in that realization, I felt a renewed sense of peace, a quiet but profound victory that went beyond any legal or financial outcome. Financially, Sophia's reckoning continued to unfold. The debt she had racked up under my name was being addressed, creditors contacted, and the looming threat of legal consequences for identity fraud hung over her like a storm cloud. I observed her navigating this reality, noticing the way her confidence wavered, the way she now considered the consequences of her actions before speaking or moving. The power she had once wielded so carelessly had been diminished, and it was a testament to the careful planning, patience, and persistence I had invested over months of preparation. Emotionally, I allowed myself moments of reflection that I hadn't permitted in years. I remembered the countless small betrayals, the dismissive gestures, the long years of being treated like a shadow. And yet, rather than feel bitterness or regret, I began to feel a sense of pride. I had endured, observed, and ultimately acted in a way that ensured justice. I had protected my dignity, reclaimed my space, and reaffirmed my value not through anger, but through patience, strategy, and quiet, unyielding determination. Evenings became a time of introspection. Sitting by the window, watching the snow fall softly across the yard, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. I had faced humiliation, manipulation, and betrayal, but I had also discovered my own strength, patience, and clarity. I had learned that standing firm does not require rage or aggression, but courage, planning, and unwavering resolve. And in that understanding, I found a sense of closure that felt both rare and precious. Jason's tentative gestures of reconciliation continued. Small conversations, shared meals, and careful attempts to rebuild trust reminded me that family, though fragile, could be mended with effort and honesty. Sophia, constrained by both law and boundaries, moved through the house with an awareness she had never possessed before. It was a quiet reminder that actions have consequences, and that the patterns of entitlement and deception she had relied on were no longer viable. I felt a deep sense of relief, knowing that the environment I had endured for so long was finally stabilizing under new rules, my rules. In this restored order, I discovered the power of deliberate action, the patience, foresight, and quiet strength I had cultivated became a shield, protecting not just my home, but my sense of self. I had endured years of mistreatment, yet emerged not embittered, but resolute, capable, and clear-minded. I realized that the true measure of resilience is not simply surviving betrayal, but using it as a catalyst to reclaim authority, dignity, and life itself. And in the stillness of those evenings, as I watched the snow settle and the house breathe with calm, I understood something essential. Love, patience, and resilience are not mutually exclusive from strength, strategy, and boundaries. I had proven to myself that endurance does not demand self-erasure, and that reclaiming one's life is not only necessary, but deeply empowering. I was no longer invisible, silenced, or powerless. I had endured, acted, and prevailed. The following months carried a rhythm I had never imagined possible after the storm of that Christmas. The house, once heavy with tension, began to breathe again, lighter, calmer, yet infused with an awareness that had not existed before. Sophia's presence no longer dominated the space. She moved carefully, speaking with calculated words, aware that any misstep could unravel her fragile standing. Jason, too, began to navigate the delicate balance between loyalty and truth, slowly recognizing the consequences of his previous inaction. Watching both of them, I realized how much power lies in quiet observation and strategic patience. I began to reclaim not just the physical space of my home, but the emotional one as well. Small gestures became my new armor, cooking meals I wanted to prepare, arranging the furniture just so, and taking quiet walks through rooms that had long felt suffocating. I found myself savoring these moments in a way I hadn't allowed before, because for so long, every action had been dictated by the whims and manipulation of Sophia. Now, every choice I made reinforced the truth that this house and this life were mine to govern. The legal processes dragged on, slow and meticulous, but each step reinforced my sense of empowerment. Sophia faced the reality of her debts, the looming consequences of identity fraud, and the undeniable proof I had carefully gathered over months. Watching her navigate this new reality, the arrogance that had once seemed unstoppable faltered. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that the life she had manipulated and exploited could not be bent to her will indefinitely. Every meeting, every document signed, every phone call was a reminder that accountability, however delayed, had arrived. Emotionally, I found a deep sense of release. The bitterness and resentment that had simmered within me for years gradually transformed into clarity and strength. I had endured humiliation, manipulation, and betrayal, yet I was no longer defined by those experiences. Instead, they had shaped me into a woman capable of decisive action, strategic thought, and unwavering resilience. The house, once a stage of constant tension, became a sanctuary, a reflection of the dignity, patience, and resolve I had cultivated through adversity. Even Jason's behavior shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. He sought my counsel, asked questions about household decisions, and began to respect boundaries he had previously ignored. These gestures, small as they were, signaled a tentative reconciliation and a willingness to rebuild trust. Sophia, constrained by both legal oversight and my firm boundaries, tread carefully, and though the tension lingered, it no longer dominated our daily lives. I observed these changes with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the years of patience and preparation were finally paying off. I also discovered the depth of my own inner strength. Enduring manipulation does not forge resilience in itself. It is the act of reclaiming control, asserting boundaries, and demanding respect that truly defines power. I realized that my victories were not only external legal documents, debts repaid, and authority restored, but profoundly internal. I had proven to myself that I could endure, strategize, and triumph over deception without compromising my integrity or dignity. The house, once a battlefield of emotional manipulation, now felt alive with a cautious peace. Every locked cabinet, every secured document, every strategic boundary was a reminder of the lessons I had learned. Patience, foresight, and deliberate action are tools of empowerment. I moved through the home with a sense of calm authority, savoring the quiet victories that came from years of careful observation and preparation. The environment itself had changed, no longer a reminder of humiliation, but a testament to resilience. In these reflective moments, I realized the profound truth that had carried me through the ordeal. Love and endurance do not demand self-erasure. Protecting oneself, asserting boundaries, and reclaiming dignity are not acts of betrayal. They are acts of survival and self-respect. I had discovered that resilience is not simply enduring adversity, but mastering it, transforming it into a force that strengthens rather than diminishes. Evenings became a time of quiet reflection. I would sit by the window, watch the snow settle on the yard, and think of the journey that had brought me here. Betrayal, humiliation, and manipulation had marked the path. Yet they had also forged the clarity and strength I now possessed. I understood that every act of patience, every careful decision, and every moment of deliberate observation had led me to a place of empowerment I had once thought impossible. And in those moments of stillness, I realized something essential. The power to protect oneself is intertwined with the courage to act, the patience to wait, and the clarity to see the truth. I had endured years of mistreatment, yet emerged not broken, but steadfast. I had reclaimed my home, my dignity, and my voice. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer silenced. I was finally free. By the time spring arrived, the house felt almost like a new home. The oppressive tension that had shadowed every room for years was replaced with a cautious but steady calm. Sophia's presence was no longer an assertion of dominance, but a reminder of the consequences of deceit. She moved carefully, measured her words, and seemed acutely aware that any attempt to manipulate or intimidate would be met with firm boundaries. Jason, too, had started to recalibrate his own behavior, showing thoughtfulness and respect that had long been absent. I watched them both, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and quiet relief. This was the life I had fought to reclaim, and it was finally, slowly, settling into reality. I spent hours walking through the house, touching the furniture, flipping through photo albums, and tidying corners that had been neglected for years. It wasn't just about cleanliness or order. It was about reclaiming a sense of ownership and pride. Each room, each shelf, each carefully curated item became a reminder that I had endured, observed, and acted decisively. The house, once a battleground, had become a testament to patience, strategy, and quiet strength. I felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that the power I had reclaimed was not fleeting. It was rooted in the careful choices I had made and the boundaries I had enforced. Sophia's financial reckoning continued to unfold, and with it came a shift in the household dynamics. Creditors were paid, debts acknowledged, and the looming threat of legal action kept her cautious. I observed her faltering confidence and precise movements, noting that the woman who once strode through my home with entitlement and arrogance now navigated the space with restraint. It was a subtle but powerful shift, a reminder that accountability, when backed by evidence and strategic action, could dismantle even the most carefully constructed web of deception. Emotionally, I allowed myself to process what had happened to acknowledge the pain, humiliation, and betrayal that had defined so many years. Yet I also recognized the transformation it had forced in me. I had learned patience, strategic thinking, and the quiet strength of deliberate action. I had discovered that enduring manipulation does not build power. Reclaiming control does. Every careful decision, every precaution, every act of measured resistance had reinforced my self-worth and restored my sense of authority. Jason's transformation, while gradual, was meaningful. He sought my input, engaged in conversations about the household, and began to respect the boundaries I had established. It was clear he was processing the reality he had previously ignored, grappling with guilt, and beginning to rebuild a relationship that had long been strained. Each small gesture of sincerity reminded me that even fractured relationships could heal when honesty, accountability, and patience guided the process. Sophia, meanwhile, remained present but diminished in influence. Her carefully constructed image of control was shattered, and she now navigated the house with calculated caution. It was a daily reminder that the power dynamics had irrevocably shifted, and that the lessons of consequence and accountability had taken root. I watched her closely, not with pleasure in her discomfort, but with the quiet affirmation that manipulation and deceit cannot endure indefinitely when met with preparedness, evidence, and unwavering resolve. I also began to notice the deeper changes within myself. The anxiety, fear, and bitterness that had colored my days gradually gave way to confidence and clarity. I had faced betrayal, humiliation, and manipulation head-on, yet I was not defined by it. Instead, I was defined by the strategic patience and courage that had allowed me to reclaim my life. The home, the family, and my own sense of self had been restored not through confrontation alone, but through deliberate, consistent, and unwavering action. In the evenings, I often sat quietly by the window, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, reflecting on the long journey from silent suffering to empowerment. I realized that love for one's family does not require self-erasure, and that standing firm in the face of betrayal is not only necessary, but transformative. I had endured years of quiet torment, yet emerged stronger, wiser, and unshakably resilient. The peace I now felt was hard-won, rooted in action, strategy, and the unwavering commitment to protect what was rightfully mine. And in those moments of reflection, I understood a truth that had eluded me for decades. The power to reclaim one's life is found not in anger or retaliation, but in patience, careful observation, and decisive action. I had reclaimed my home, my dignity, and my voice. I was no longer invisible, silenced, or powerless. I had endured, acted, and prevailed. And in that triumph, I discovered the unshakable strength that comes from standing firm in one's own truth. The air in the house was lighter now, filled with cautious respect and tentative reconciliation. I moved freely, walked confidently through the rooms, and felt a renewed connection to the life I had built and the family I had fought to preserve. It was a life reshaped by betrayal, but reclaimed through resilience, a life that now reflected the woman I had become, unyielding, strategic, and resolute. And in that quiet, reclaimed space, I finally knew. The mother I had always been, the one who loved, sacrificed, and endured, was also the woman who could protect herself, her home, and her worth. I had lost years to deception and manipulation, but I had not lost myself. I had endured, acted, and emerged victorious. The months turned into a rhythm that felt steady, almost ordinary. Yet beneath that ordinariness was the quiet satisfaction of hard-won control. Sophia, constrained by legal oversight and my carefully set boundaries, moved cautiously through the house, Her once bold steps were now tentative, her words measured. The arrogance and entitlement that had dominated our home were replaced by caution, and even the smallest misstep was carefully calculated. Jason, still grappling with guilt and his own complicity, began showing a degree of thoughtfulness that had been absent for years. Witnessing this shift, I felt a sense of quiet triumph. This was the life I had fought to reclaim, and finally, it was unfolding before me. I began to immerse myself in routines I had long abandoned. Cooking, arranging, cleaning, not as obligations, but as acts of reclamation. Every meal I prepared, every room I tidied, every item I handled became a statement. This is my home, my life, my authority. I savored the simple pleasure of control, the reassurance that my efforts were no longer invisible or unappreciated. The house, once a battlefield of manipulation and quiet suffering, now reflected the woman I had become, resolute, observant, and unapologetically present. The legal proceedings continued to unfold methodically. Sophia's debts were addressed, her financial mismanagement scrutinized, and the looming consequences of identity fraud weighed heavily on her. Every phone call, every meeting, and every document she signed was a reminder that her attempts to manipulate and deceive were finally met with accountability. Watching her navigate this reality reinforced a truth I had long understood. Manipulation only works when unchecked, and evidence combined with patience is a force stronger than arrogance or entitlement. Emotionally, I felt a profound shift within myself. The fear, resentment, and sadness that had shadowed me for years gradually transformed into clarity and empowerment. I had endured humiliation, betrayal, and manipulation, but I was no longer defined by those experiences. Instead, they had shaped me into someone capable of deliberate action, strategic thinking, and unwavering resilience. My victories were both external in the form of restored authority, secured boundaries, and legal enforcement, and internal, reflected in a restored sense of dignity and self-worth. Jason's approach became more deliberate too. He began consulting me on decisions, seeking my advice on household matters, and acknowledging the reality he had once chosen to ignore. These small acts of sincerity were more than gestures. They were the first signs of a reconciliation that, while tentative, held promise. Sophia, aware that her previous patterns of manipulation were no longer viable, moved with careful restraint. The dynamic of the household had irrevocably shifted, and it was a reminder that the lessons of consequence and accountability could not be ignored. I also became acutely aware of the internal transformation I had undergone. Endurance alone does not build strength. It is deliberate, strategic action that restores power. Every step I had taken, from careful documentation to the decisive confrontation, reinforced my authority and reclaimed my life. The house itself, once a silent witness to my subjugation, now reflected my triumph and the boundaries I had firmly established. I could move through it freely, confidently, with no fear of manipulation or disrespect. In the quiet evenings, as I sat by the window watching the sunset, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Years of betrayal and manipulation had taught me patience, clarity, and courage. I realized that protecting oneself, asserting boundaries, and reclaiming dignity are acts of strength, not betrayal. I had endured, acted, and triumphed not through anger, but through deliberate, measured, and unwavering determination. The home, the family, and my own sense of self had been restored. The air felt lighter, filled with cautious respect and tentative reconciliation. I moved through the rooms with a quiet confidence, savoring the regained control over my life. The lessons of betrayal, endurance, and empowerment were now etched into every corner of the house, every interaction with my son, and every carefully monitored boundary I maintained. And in this reclaimed space, I understood a truth that had eluded me for decades. The mother, I had always been the one who loved, sacrificed, and endured, was also the woman who could protect herself, her home, and her worth. The years of silent suffering were gone, replaced with clarity, authority, and self-respect. I had endured, acted, and emerged victorious. In the end, I realized that strength is quiet, resilience is deliberate, and dignity cannot be stolen, it must be claimed. I was no longer invisible, silenced, or powerless. I had survived, acted decisively, and reclaimed my life. The journey had been long and painful, but the victory was mine. And as I stood in the center of my home, surrounded by the echoes of a Christmas gone awry, I finally felt the truth settle deep in my bones. Love doesn't die in betrayal. It transforms, and so did I. Thank you for watching.